I got to tell you, in talking to some of the largest enterprises, and if I name names, you would know exactly who I'm talking about. It was surprising to see that a lot of them not only were not conducting any type of risk assessment on an annual basis, you should be doing it on a regular basis. Some of the answers I would get would be, yeah, last time that we ran a security assessment was 5 years ago. I mean, your organization has changed in the last 5 years, so that you wouldn't. Or just the lack of policies or the lack of, again, incident response plans, disaster recovery plans, things of that nature.
Welcome to CyberSecurity Heroes, an IRONSCALES podcast about you, the heroes of cybersecurity. You're about to hear and learn practical and experiential knowledge in our conversations with security leaders and practitioners and other influential InfoSec stars, so we can become more cyber resilient and safer together. CyberSecurity Heroes is brought to you by IRONSCALES, the most powerfully simple email security platform. And I'm your host, Brendan Rudd. And now, let's get into the show. Hey Harris, welcome to the show.
Hi. Hey Brendan, how are you?
Good, thanks. Great to have you here today. But before we begin, I'd love for you to tell our listeners a little bit about you, your background, and what you're working on these days.
Yeah, sounds good. Thanks again for inviting me. I'm currently the Field Chief Information Security Officer for a company called Elevate Security. I've been in the industry for about 30 years. I'm dating myself a little bit, but I'd say, I'd categorize my experience as half of my career has been working directly for companies, building out security programs, building teams and things of that nature. And then the other half has been in consulting roles where I've been virtual CISO or working in threat intelligence or working in an investigations capacity.
I guess in security, your experience is like wine. You only get better as you mature.
I guess so, yes.
You don't just throw technology at the problem.
Yes. Yeah. Too many. We all know technology is pretty prevalent within the security industry, and a lot of companies and organizations are using technology, a lot of technology in some cases.
A great segue to open up today's episode. We want to talk about this shift in security posture from defensive to offensive. And last time we spoke, you mentioned since the Target breach, companies have been investing a lot in tools and people to detect and respond. What was the strategy and the movement around this post-Target breach?
Yeah, I would definitely say that I think cybersecurity is where it is today because of those retail breaches back in 2013, I guess it was 2012, 2013, somewhere around there. Of course, that started with the Target breach. And then there were many other retailers and hospitality chains that followed. And I think a lot of companies back then were really focused on having as many tools as possible, people as well, staffing. Maybe they had the proper levels of people. But I think back then it was all about, I'd say after the retail breaches, the focus was on how do we defend and how do we respond as quickly as possible. And I think that a lot of organizations were 100% focused on that. And they weren't really focused on that prevention and the offensive aspect of security, where you're trying to identify what your risks are in order to prevent the incidents. And I'd say even to today or present time, companies are still focused on defense and response.
With all the tools and training in place, it seems, at least in the media, and I know that the media is not necessarily the be end and end all, but it still feels like we're not that much better off than we were. BEC ransomware is still alive and kicking. And what has all these tools really done for us? Are we any better off than we were post-Target breach and all those retail breaches?
No, not really, because as you just mentioned, we still have ransomware, we still have business email compromise, we have other email scams and attacks and things of that nature. I think with organizations that have too many tools, that generates a lot of alerts, right? A lot of events, whether you're using a SIM or not, or whatever tools are conducting monitoring of your network and your environments. And of course, the prevalent number of environments that some organizations have, the cloud and then on-premise, and if they've got retail or if they've got e-commerce is huge right now. I think having all of these tools and things, they generate a lot of alerts. Some of them could be false positives, et cetera. And then you still have teams that have to investigate those issues. How fast can we respond to an incident? And then you have to be able to contain it, that sort of thing. But I think the common denominator with ransomware and phishing in general and all of that is really the human being.
So if you would go back in time, how would you have changed the strategy instead of tools? What would you have done differently? What do you think would have been a better choice? Or is it just a matter of getting all the vendors to fine tune their products better and work better with their customers on how to use those tools?
Yeah, I think organizations have to take a balanced approach when it comes to security, whether you're using, if we look at NIST, as an example, NIST CSF or NIST 800-53, there's various realms of that framework. And again, most organizations are in the detect and respond and not really the identify and protect, which is your number one and number two slot. But like you mentioned, tools and the maturity of an organization, even if you look at the maturity of tools, the tools started off. Let's take endpoint security for an example, the semantics, and I don't like to, name names. An endpoint tool, let's say back 20 years or even 10 years was signature based, right? Then they evolved and they became more behavioral based, trying to understand human behavior and that type of thing. And then now we're into that AI and machine learning phase where we're trying to advance the way that tools work and things like that. It's obviously we need to have certain tools in the environment and whatnot, but there also has to be, like I said, balanced approach among the people, process, and technology. When you're conducting, as an example, a risk assessment of the organization, you're looking at people, process, and technology.
As a CISO, how have you seen the industry change? What have you been influenced by vendors or have you been influenced by your peers? What strategy have you taken over the last few years, as you mentioned, shifting towards offensive strategies or just shifting strategies in general?
Yeah, I'd say in the past when I was working for companies directly in that role or a senior leadership role, I'd say that part of my strategy was definitely based on what some of my other peers were doing with participation in some of the ISACs, like the retail ISAC or financial ISAC. We're always looking to what everyone else is doing and how they're addressing certain issues. So I'd say, that's part of it. What are the trends right now in the industry and how do we obviously fix the problem or address the problem? Vendors do definitely play a part in that strategy and that roadmap that you're trying to develop, because you're constantly getting communication from vendors that are talking about, hey, we've got this solution and I think this can address this. But I think more importantly for a CISO, you have to have a strategy in mind. You have to have a roadmap in mind. And then when it comes to vendors and things, it's about identifying what vendors fit into that strategy, rather than the reverse where they're directing your strategy. So I think that's definitely very important to have that already.
And you were talking to me about investing more and understanding the workforce. Can you explain what you mean by that and how does that look like?
Yeah, so I'd say a couple different things. I think I was referencing my time in consulting at the last couple companies that I was at. And in talking with some of the enterprise clients that we had, a lot of them were lacking what I would call the fundamentals or the foundational measures of security. a lot of that was security risk assessment, for one. At least when I started out in the industry, the idea of understanding what your environment is and how it functions and where your risks and threats and vulnerabilities and things, really the only way to do that is to conduct some type of risk assessment or a security assessment focused on, again, people, process, and technology. It could be more focused on technology or more focused on an area, depending upon your business. But you kind of have to understand what that is to start. But then, security awareness. I think every organization has some level of security awareness to educate the workforce. Does it work? Some of it does, some of it doesn't. I think there needs to be that repeat or a repeatable process to maintain your workforce so that they are responding in a positive manner rather than a negative manner. I think if you look at a lot of the industry reports that are out there, they talk about the insider or insider threat, right? There's different types of insider threat. I think most people think about the malicious insider, someone that's after financial gain, or they're working for a nation state, or even a competitor. They're trying to steal data, information, intellectual property, trade secrets, things like that from your organization. But actually, the larger portion of insider threat is actually what they call unintentional insider or the accidental insider. Or years ago, we used to call it the negligent insider. But these are really your workforce users. This could be employees. It could be contractors, individuals that have access or trusted access to your network and whatnot. That just by a matter of clicking on a link in an email or downloading a file could introduce negative effects on your environment. It's how do you stay abreast of that? But how do you but how do you drive constant change for your workforce so that they improve and so that your environment improves? And then in the end, being able to prevent those incidents from happening in the first place, rather than being reactive with that defend and respond, but being more proactive and driving a behavioral change with your users, and then having what I would call actionable insights into your workforce, what they're doing on a day-to-day basis. Not Big Brother and not that, but again, all comes down to workforce risk.
So if I understood you correctly, it's like being proactive equals offensive, at least in the big picture. Obviously, there's more that is made up of, but you mentioned some of the basics like awareness and training. What else would you say is the makeup of an offensive program or posture?
So if I think about being proactive, and this also goes back to my consulting days as well, or at least the last couple of consulting engagements, where we're finding that organizations don't have proper processes in place. So things like an incident response plan or a disaster recovery plan, or they're not even thinking about disaster recovery because they're relying on the third party to do that. And they don't think that they have the responsibility or the need to do that. Playbooks for how to, respond to various incidents and things, I think is important. And then even proper, what I'd call training or testing of your plan. So through tabletop exercises or attack simulations. Right now, it's been the last, I'd say probably a few years or so, but the use of cyber ranges for training your SOC members and for testing of your playbooks and things of that nature, hiring of SOC analysts and things like that. Some of those solutions have popped up as well.
Got it. Yeah, that's great. So it's like being proactive, being prepared, which means having a plan and testing your plan, being ready is all part of that offensive posture. So that makes a lot of sense. If we will speak about like metrics, what metrics or leading indicators can you speak to of companies that take this approach? Like, I'm not sure not getting hacked equals success. You might just not be a target or you got lucky, right?
If I think back to when I worked directly for companies, metrics and KPIs or key performance indicators were definitely important. And some of the things that we were tracking and reporting up to audit committees or even to the board or even to C-level executives were around our resilience and around our threat and vulnerability management. Certainly, vulnerabilities are definitely still rampant in our environment. They'll continue to be rampant. I think every industry report that's come out constantly talks about vulnerabilities and patching. That's here to stay. That's never going to go away. And so we would always track various metrics around our endpoints, where we were from a rate of being patched, updated. Do we have any end of life systems in place? What are we doing to mitigate that? Mitigation was a large part of a lot of these metrics or surrounded a lot of these metrics, how we're mitigating or what type of mitigating controls we had in place to resolve some of those issues and things like that. We also did track metrics around any type of testing that we performed or campaigns. So phishing campaigns, a lot of companies are conducting those. But we did want to understand what was the likelihood of a user clicking on the link or clicking on one of these phish tests, and then how do we address that? Do we address that with more education? Is that more one-on-one education, or is it you're going to go take a class and those sorts of things?
Yeah, that's an interesting point because from speaking with people in the field, the first reflex is to throw more training at those people. But maybe there are other alternatives like, hey, maybe we should have a discussion with you one-on-one. Like, hey, why are you clicking these emails? Like, you can't get that information or understanding if you just keep throwing more training on them. And secondly, who should have those conversations? Is it the IT team? Is it HR? I'm not sure how you dealt with it as the CISO.
Yeah, I think every organization is different. I think that a lot of organizations take the interaction with employees very different than they used to. It used to be IT that would be responsible. They'd throw some education at them, and that was that. And usually that training was boring. But I think now, a lot more organizations are trying to be sensitive when they're dealing with employees. And so it might be HR, it may be someone that's trained, right, in dealing with employees and the sensitivity of it. And so they're utilizing other professionals within the organization that might be addressing them. Or it might be their manager, because the manager is responsible for their employees. And so manager makes a lot of sense rather than someone from security or someone from IT.
Yeah, you don't want to freak people out. You want to make it a natural conversation. Maybe it's in your one-on-one. Hey, by the way, we noticed that you were clicking these links. We would love to understand what we're conveying through the training. Our training is not good enough. Trying to really uncover in a more relaxed setting rather than making a huge deal of it. So yeah, I'm sure it's not like one size fits all, but yeah, an interesting.
Yeah, and you want to make it, I think nowadays it's important to make it positive, but to also provide recommendations on how they can improve, like their individual security posture, let's say. You have the security posture of the organization, but you also have the individual as well. And there could be insights that would be helpful for them to improve that posture, but making it positive, not negative, like it used to be.
Definitely. And speaking of insights, you told me that you've uncovered some pretty shocking insights.
At my past company that I worked for in the consulting realm, because I was dealing with a lot of enterprise clients that were trying to either build out a strategy for their security roadmap, or in a lot of cases, they were trying to renew their cyber insurance. And the insurance carriers have decided that they're going to make it more difficult for companies to renew unless they have, again, I hate to call it foundational, but some of the foundational security measures in place to be able to prevent a lot of that risk, certainly around ransomware and data loss and those types of things. And so we came out with, it's called a ransomware supplemental questionnaire that they require all their clients or all their customers that are getting ready to renew sort of have to go through the questionnaire and fill it out. And then they're using that as a basis for determining, are we going to renew you at the same premium that you had last year? or are we going to raise your premium, or are we going to drop you? And talking to clients about that questionnaire, which again, a lot of it was basic stuff. Are you using multi-factor authentication? Are you monitoring your networks? Or are you using a SIM, or are you using an MSSP? Do you have endpoint protection? Do you run vulnerability scanning? How often do you patch? And again, these are fundamental measures or controls that any organization should have. I got to tell you, in talking to some of the largest enterprises, and if I name names, you would know exactly who I'm talking about, it was surprising to see that a lot of them not only were not conducting any type of risk assessment on an annual basis, you should be doing it on a regular basis. Some of the answers I would get would be, yeah, last time that we ran a security assessment was 5 years ago. I mean, your organization has changed in the last 5 years, so that you wouldn't. Or just the lack of policies, or the lack of, again, incident response plans, disaster recovery plans, things of that nature.
And when you're referring to the security controls, you're talking about ISO 27001 or the NIST framework. Is that what you're referring to?
Well, so talking about NIST and talking about ISO, right? NIST is really defined for, or was really created for federal, U.S. federal agencies to utilize as a security framework. That has evolved over the years, even when it first came out more than 20 years ago. I think a lot of companies and a lot of organizations outside of the federal government have implemented NIST cybersecurity framework, which is newer than 800-53 or some of the others. I think primarily a lot of companies that are or could be classified as a critical infrastructure, certainly banks and financial sector and healthcare, things like that, where they want to have the best controls in place. NIST is definitely more technical in nature than ISO is really risk-based, less technical, but risk-based. You do find a lot of what I'd say multinational or global organizations that use ISO because they have a mature program in place, especially around risk.
Okay. So how would you go about advising companies on which one to choose?
From a consulting perspective, I always push people to use NIST just because it is more technical. And a lot of so there's a couple frameworks within NIST around incident response. So that's NIST 800-61, which was a framework that we used in our consulting with clients, on how to build out an incident response plan or how to build out playbooks or even testing. NIST is nice because it has specific frameworks that are built around various areas. So like business continuity and disaster recovery, 800-34, I think it is. And then even from the manufacturing side of things, they've got their own framework as well. It just comes down to, preference and I think maturity in an organization, what they want to use.
So speaking about maturity, are you saying that these frameworks are not necessarily for startups and smaller companies?
I've seen startups use NIST. I've seen a lot of startups use the CIS Top 20 as a smaller framework because there's only 20 controls. And those, again, are a lot of those foundational or fundamental, measures and things like that. I see some organizations not use anything at all. If they're a product company, they might be using OWASP or they might be using Cloud Security Alliance as a foundation. Again, I think it just really depends upon who's running security at those organizations. What do they know? What have they used in the past? Maybe they're using a subset of ISO or a subset of NIST as a starting point or a benchmarking point, and then growing from there.
Do you have to complete the entire framework, or can you pick and choose depending on, what is needed most?
Again, it just depends. I've seen organizations that have taken NIST CSF, for example, and they'll conduct a gap assessment against their organization. So they'll take all of the controls and then identify where they are successful and meeting those controls and then where they're not, and then utilize that to build out their security roadmap for the next 3 years or 5 years. So I've seen that happen. I've seen a lot of organizations that if, let's say, they're they have a need to be compliant with like HIPAA or GDPR or PCI, utilize those controls as a priority and then build around that with a NIST or an ISO. Because a lot of times, a lot of those requirements are going to be within NIST or ISO as well.
So it sounds like the entire framework is really your goal and your objective, and you just should prioritize it based on the assessment and then plugging those holes in order of severity based on your resources and your time frame that you can achieve that complete framework. I know this may sound like trivia for a lot of people, but you told me that as a consultant, you saw many folks in mid-enterprise and enterprise companies that didn't even have the fundamentals of any of these frameworks in place. So if they didn't have these things in place, what were they focusing their security on? Why wasn't this a priority?
It's hard to say because most of those organizations, some of them would admit that they were busy with other initiatives.
Can you break down what those other initiatives were that were more important, and why did they not understand the importance of having the basics in place?
I think part of it was they didn't have knowledgeable people or experienced people on their staff. They had people that, let's say, were maybe working in IT or other areas of the company that they brought into the security realm, but they didn't really have that requisite experience or a hands-on experience in being able to develop some of those fundamentals and things like that. In a lot of companies where their product or their solution was the priority, they were less inclined to implement enterprise controls and things of that nature, whereas they were focused on building their product, and that sort of thing. But it was interesting because a lot of those companies, if let's say they had developers, whether internally or externally, writing code and that sort of thing, they were still lacking fundamentals like scanning your code for vulnerabilities before it gets pushed into production. And again, a lot of the response from people were like, yeah, we know that security exists, but, we have to get our product out.
And a few conversations with other guests that sort of gave me another angle, which probably you've heard of as well. Like you have companies have security minded founders, and then you have founders that are not security minded. And that's the difference between having a company that does security well versus doesn't. It's all about prioritization, and security is not free. It's an expensive operation. If you don't invest in it, then the use cases you're describing is probably the outcome of that.
Yes, I would completely agree with that. It was actually in a lot of these organizations, it was typically the general counsel. It was actually other people that had experience with security that were bringing these issues top of mind. But again, if you've got someone that's running, product development and they don't have security experience, then you're less likely to have proactive approach or investment in security. That whereas someone that does have that experience or at least knowledgeable of security and wants to invest in it and be proactive, then you're going to get that. But yeah, a lot of companies know.
You also talked about working with MSSPs without having your own internal strategy in place and kind of relying on outside counsel before you've done your own due diligence.
I think a lot of organizations, and again, it doesn't matter on the size of the organization. I think whether it's an MSSP or a cloud provider or whoever the third party is that's handling a portion of your business, I think companies get complacent. They rely on that third party or think that third party, has a responsibility for, let's say, an incident response plan or how you're going to respond to a particular incident. When in reality, it's really the organization's responsibility in the first place. Now, your third-party provider, they might have plans and processes in place and things of that nature, but they really have to work towards whatever your requirements are. So having requirements in place for those third parties is definitely important. I mean, I've seen it all the time. I was just having this conversation with someone else on the same subject, just talking about let's say, password security in a cloud environment. You hear about all these breaches in the cloud because a company uses default passwords or they rely on the cloud provider to provide security when it's really your responsibility.
Makes sense. So I want to move into the work that you're doing now with Elevate Security. So where does the work that you're doing right now with Elevate Security fit into a company's security model? At what stage should companies be thinking about the problems that you're solving?
Yeah, so it's interesting. Elevate is addressing an issue around workforce risk that I haven't really found in really any other provider. I see some companies that are, let's say, doing a portion of what Elevate is doing, but Elevate's looking at the unintentional insider risk. Again, I think most companies are looking at malicious through a UEBA type platform or even through SIM monitoring. They've got use cases for malicious insider, but they're not really addressing the unintentional. And Elevate is doing that through a couple of different ways. When they started out, they were more focused on security awareness. And I know we've talked about security awareness before. There's not a lot of effort, let's say, on the security awareness side. And so they quickly learned that by having or instituting controls, having actionable insights around workforce behavior, they're able to help customers put in guardrails. I like the word guardrails. Let's say you have users in your workforce that have higher risk levels, then there's ways of implementing more controls or what we call tailored controls around those users. Maybe that's simply placing them as a high risk user within Okta or whatever your identity access management solution is or whatever your endpoint solution is or that type of thing. But we're basically taking in logs, and most of these logs are logs that customers are already using, whether they're using a UEBA or a SIM or that type of thing. But we're taking in email, we're taking in web gateway, endpoint, and identity. We're analyzing it, and then we're providing insights on each user in the workforce. And again, so that what we talked about in the past about that positive reinforcement or the security posture of the individual, we provide insights to each individual. And the majority of our customers will send out monthly emails to employees with these positive insights. How can they improve their posture? So everything's positive, right? It's not negative. We're not name shaming you and things of that nature. But on the other side, that's very interesting is being able to push certain policies, playbooks. We have these risk detection rules and then controls so that, okay, yeah, we're letting you know that there's an issue with a particular user. How can we control them? How can we put in more that guardrail and that type of thing? So yeah, it's very interesting.
So can you give us a few examples of these sort of things you're monitoring and what you can essentially trigger based off of what you're seeing?
Yeah. So, I would say that our top 3 use cases for our customers are preventing. It's really about identifying your high risk users and then being able to prevent. So our top 3 use cases are preventing ransomware, preventing data loss, and then preventing account takeover, account compromise. Those are really the 3 top use cases that our customers are using it for. Bringing in email logs or email gateway logs and endpoint logs and things of that nature. We're able to see what's the attackability of a particular user. Do they have the likelihood of clicking on links, right, which could cause ransomware or cause malware to be downloaded? Are they visiting websites that are malicious? Now, granted, right, the customer, through whatever mitigating controls are at the perimeter, at the endpoint, et cetera, that activity may have been blocked. But you're still getting the insight that, that you have an employee or a user that is clicking on those links or is trying to download content that might be malicious. So again, it's providing more of that insight about that user, but then taking action or taking measures to prevent that in the future.
So really you need to profile the user as best as possible, and you need to get as many sources as you can. And those are the four that at a minimum, like you said, you need to pull in to build this profile.
Yeah, for the most part, because if you just taking ransomware as an example, we know that phishing is probably the number one source of ransomware. So that's going to be your email. Clicking on a link that could take you to a malicious site. So there's always that possibility. Identity, of course, is very important, especially, let's say, an organization that doesn't have multi-factor in place. And you've got privileged access users that are the one causing the ransomware or the ones that are targeted as part of the ransomware. So understanding, as an example, if you have a user that's high risk because they have the likelihood of being attacked or clicking a link or downloading malicious content, but at the same time, they're also a privileged access user, that would be a problem for the organization. That's something that an organization should want to know and to be able to either place more controls around that user or guardrails and be able to improve. So maybe they don't have multi-factor implemented. Maybe that's something that they need to implement in their organization. So we're also providing recommendations for how to mitigate some of those issues as well.
Interesting. And how is this challenge being solved today?
It's being solved piecemeal. I think it's being solved through different tools or different processes. And so it's been very interesting just looking at the industry in general, what is out there, how are people addressing this? And even when it comes down to actually having discussions with people, hey, how do you guys handle the unintentional insider? And it's interesting because, again, a lot of people are just not, I don't know, it's weird. They're not concerned with it. They're concerned about the malicious side. They're concerned about being reactive rather than proactive. Yeah, it's interesting.
And if we come full circle on this, it feels like the way this ties into offensive security is, you need to understand your gap analysis, but you're really continuously monitoring your workforce. We were talking about, investing in your workforce. This is understanding your workforce, who is susceptible, and again, fitting into that proactive stance. So would you agree that what you're doing fits into the offensive security model?
Yeah, I would definitely agree with you. I think we need to change the mindset. Just again, going back to the retail breach, the mindset went to how do we defend and how do we respond as quickly as possible? I think I don't want to say we're over that. We still have to do that, but there has to be a balance and we need to be a little bit more preventative and proactive. And I think that, again, it's that balanced approach and that sort of thing. We need to look at the whole picture, not just part of the picture. But I think it's going to be a lot of behavioral change among the industry, being able to focus on more than just the defend and respond.
Yeah, because everyone is always either blaming the end users / the employees. The only solution that you really hear about is more training. Yes, training is part of that, but understanding really who's at risk and maybe just focusing on the risk versus treating everyone one size fits all. Perhaps that's another sort of added value that comes with understanding your organization as individuals versus one entity.
I would agree with that because one of the insights that we get or that our customers are getting is you're certainly identifying your high risk users, but you're also identifying users that if you were to implement a security champions program in your organization, this is a great way to acknowledge users and employees and whatnot that are doing the right thing and have a high, let's say, security posture as compared to the ones that are not, right? The ones that need the focus and the attention and more controls. So yes, I agree with your statement.
As we wrap up here today, if anybody would like to get in touch with you, what's the best way to reach out? Are you an email guy, a LinkedIn guy?
Yeah, I'm definitely a LinkedIn guy. You can definitely hit me up on LinkedIn. Email is fine too. It's harris@elevatesecurity.com. So pretty easy. Yeah, definitely feel free to reach out. Happy to have a chat, happy to show you what we're doing, or just to network.
Awesome. Thank you, Harris. It was great having you on the show, and thank you so much for taking the time to join us today on Cybersecurity Heroes. To the rest of you, we'll see you next time.
Thank you.
That's a wrap for this episode of Cybersecurity Heroes. Practical and experiential knowledge on a day in the life of security heroes. Catch our next episode by subscribing or following through your favorite podcast platform. If you're listening on Apple Podcast, please leave a rating for the show. They really help a lot. Thank you so much for listening. Until next time.